The Hawthorne Inn, Cicero, Illinois, October 1927. When Frank Costello stepped into the private dining room, every man at the table rose to their feet except one. Al Capone stayed seated. His chair remained pushed back just enough to look casual. A cigar burned slowly between his fingers, smoke drifting upward in lazy spirals. His eyes were locked on Costello, calm and unblinking, like a man watching a calculation resolve itself. Costello's bodyguards stiffened instantly. Hands slid beneath jackets. Fingers brushed cold steel. One wrong move and the room would explode. Capone lifted a single hand. That was enough. Because the man still standing in the doorway controlled political influence, New York money, and national connections. But the man still seated controlled Chicago. And what Capone said in the next 60 seconds would determine whether this meeting ended in a historic alliance or a war that would turn the Midwest red. October 1927, Prohibition was roaring. And America was pretending not to notice. Chicago wasn't pretending about anything. The city ran on liquor, payoffs, and silence. Speakeasies outnumbered grocery stores. Judges answered phones they shouldn't. Cops worked 2 payrolls without shame. And at the center of it all sat Alphonse Capone. At 28, Capone had already taken what others spent lifetimes chasing. Johnny Torrio was gone. Rival crews were buried or broken. The outfit answered to one voice now, his. But even Capone understood that guns only ruled streets. Empires were decided elsewhere. Costello finally stepped forward, forcing a smile as he approached the table. "Al," he said evenly. "Good to see you." Capone didn't stand, didn't smile. "Frank," Capone replied. "You came a long way, sit." Only then did the room breathe again. Costello took the seat across from him, aware of exactly what had just happened. This wasn't disrespect. It was a declaration. Capone leaned back, cigar glowing faintly in the low light. "You don't come to Cicero unless you want something," Capone said. "So let's not waste time pretending." Costello folded his hands. "Fair enough." Outside the room, the city waited. Inside it, power was about to be negotiated. Costello sat carefully, aware that every inch of movement carried meaning. Across from him, Capone hadn't shifted an ounce. The cigar stayed where it was. The stare never softened. "You didn't come alone," Capone said. "No," Costello admitted. "Didn't think you would either." Capone smiled faintly. "Smart man." He finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The room followed his motion instinctively, like gravity had increased. "Let's get something straight," Capone said. "You're not here to tell me what New York wants. You're here to find out what Chicago will allow." Costello nodded once. "Fair." Outside, a car engine idled too long, then moved on. Inside, no one spoke. Costello chose his words carefully. The outfit's reach has grown faster than anyone expected. East Coast money's tied up in Midwest liquor now. That creates interest. Capone exhaled smoke slowly. "Interest usually shows up with soldiers." "Not this time," Costello said. "This time it shows up with proposals." Capone chuckled. "That's new," Costello continued. "Transportation, distribution, banking, there's overlap. New York thinks cooperation makes more sense than competition." Capone's eyes narrowed just slightly. "And what does cooperation look like when you say it out loud?" Costello hesitated a fraction too long. Capone noticed. "Careful," Capone said. "That pause costs you." Costello sighed. "A percentage. Access to routes. Shared protection on interstate shipments." Capone tapped ash into the tray. "You want a cut of Chicago?" "No," Costello said quickly. "We want continuity." Capone laughed softly. "That's just a polite word for control." Costello didn't argue. Capone stood then. Slow, deliberate. Chairs creaked. Guards straightened. The room tightened around him. He walked to the window, looking out over Cicero's quiet streets. "You know what keeps Chicago running?" Capone asked without turning. "It ain't liquor. It ain't guns. It's men showing up to work. Drivers, dock hands, warehouse crews." Costello frowned slightly. "Unions." Capone turned back, smiling. "Exactly." He walked back to the table and leaned in close, voice lower now. I don't own them, Capone said, but I don't cross them either. Costello studied him. You built your empire without them. I built it loud, Capone corrected. I'm keeping it quiet because of them. Costello leaned back, understanding beginning to form. So what are you saying? I'm saying, Capone replied, you don't negotiate Chicago through New York. You negotiate it through the men who keep the city breathing. Costello absorbed that. And if New York doesn't like that? I asked. Capone shrugged. Then New York stays in New York. The tension thickened. Costello cleared his throat. What if I told you we already tried going around them? Capone's smile vanished. And? He asked. Costello exhaled. Trucks didn't show. Drivers quit. Warehouses failed inspections overnight. Capone nodded slowly. Now you're learning. Costello leaned forward. So what's the play? Capone picked up his cigar again, eyes steady. You don't take Chicago, he said. You work beside it. You want access, you pay for services, banking, lawyers, political insulation. And the percentage? Costello asked. Capone didn't answer immediately. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere far away. 10, Capone said finally. Net, monthly. Costello blinked. Lower than expected. And the conditions? Costello asked. Capone leaned back into his chair, reclaiming it fully. No New York soldiers in Chicago neighborhoods, Capone said. No collections, no pressure. You want your money, you send a courier. Quietly. Costello considered it. And if someone breaks the rule? Capone's voice stayed calm. Then they learn why rules exist. Costello nodded slowly. I'll take it back. Capone met his eyes. You'll take it back and sell it, Costello smiled thinly. You don't lack confidence, Capone smiled back. I lack patience. Silence settled again. Costello stood. You always sit when men walk in? Capone looked up at him. Only when I already own the room? Costello laughed under his breath. I'll remember that. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Because both men understood something as Costello walked out into the night. This wasn't a meeting about territory. It was about permission. Costello left Cicero before midnight, his car disappearing down a road that belonged to Capone long before it belonged to the city. Inside the Hawthorne Inn, nothing moved for several seconds after the door closed. Then Capone sat back fully, the tension draining from the room as if someone had opened a valve. Nitti spoke first. You think New York bites? Capone didn't answer right away. He stared at the glowing tip of his cigar, watching it burn down to ash. They don't have a choice, Capone said. They can't fight Chicago without fighting the people who keep it alive. Rika nodded. And if they try? Capone looked up, his expression flat. Then they learn what Dutch Schultz never did. No one asked him to explain. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. That was the answer. No new crews crossed state lines. No muscle showed up in Chicago neighborhoods. No rumors of retaliation reached Cicero. Instead, quiet confirmations arrived. Banking arrangements adjusted. Lawyers introduced. Intermediaries sent with respectful language and careful timing. 10% net monthly, just like Capone said. By early 1928, the arrangement was invisible to anyone who didn't already know where to look. Money flowed east without noise. Protection flowed west without uniforms. And the unions remained untouched, unpressured, and crucially undisturbed. Capone had done what very few men ever managed. He made power boring. That scared his enemies more than violence ever had. As the years rolled forward, the city hardened around the structure Capone helped lock into place. When rivals tested the edges, the response never came from Capone directly. Licenses vanished. Contracts dissolved. Men found themselves unemployable without knowing why. No warnings, no funerals, just erasure. Capone understood then what lasting dominance really required. Not fear, not loyalty, predictability. When the government finally came for him, it didn't come with guns. It came with ledgers, taxes. The irony wasn't lost on him. In 1931, as he stood in a courtroom instead of a back room, Capone didn't look angry. He looked almost amused. He had already seen this ending coming. From behind bars, he watched Chicago continue without him. Liquor still moved. Money still circulated. The city still breathed, and that was when the truth settled in. He had won long before he lost. Capone would never again sit at the head of a table like the one in Cicero. His body would weaken, his mind would fade, his name would become legend, then warning. But the rules he enforced that night, the quiet ones, the unseen ones, outlived him, because kings fall, systems don't. And Chicago, relentless and indifferent, carried on exactly as it always had, answering not to noise, not to violence, but to men smart enough to know when staying seated was the most powerful move of all. By the time the 1930s settled in, Chicago no longer revolved around personalities. It revolved around routines. Deliveries arrived on schedule. Payments were made without reminders. Lawyers showed up before warrants did. Judges asked fewer questions, and unions, once volatile, once unpredictable, operated with mechanical precision. The city had learned discipline. Capone watched this transformation from a distance, first through trusted voices, later through fragments of newspapers and guarded conversations. He saw how the outfit no longer needed spectacle to assert dominance, how younger men spoke less and listened more, how violence, once a tool of introduction, became a tool of last resort. That hadn't been the plan at first, but it became the outcome. Inside prison walls, Capone had time to reflect. Too much time. He replayed that night in Cicero more than any shootout, more than any raid. The moment he stayed seated, the moment he chose structure over chaos, the moment he understood that fear was loud, but respect was permanent. Outside, the country changed. Prohibition ended. Speakeasies became bars. Bootleggers became businessmen. Chicago adjusted again. Many of Capone's former enemies tried to re-enter the game, believing the fall of one man meant opportunity. They were wrong. The city no longer responded to bravado. It responded to alignment. If you fit the system, you survived. If you disrupted it, you were quietly removed. No announcements, no warnings, just absence. Men vanished from ledgers before they vanished from streets. By the early 1940s, federal pressure shifted toward larger threats overseas. Attention moved. Resources were redirected. Chicago slipped back into the background, stable and productive in ways few cities could claim. Capone's name still carried weight, but it no longer carried instructions. That was the final proof. Power had detached from the man who once embodied it, and that made it unstoppable. Those who truly understood what happened never framed Capone as a failure. They framed him as a catalyst, the last loud king before the quiet age began, the man whose rise forced everyone else to evolve. He had shown them the ceiling. They learned how to live beneath it. As Capone's health declined, visitors noticed something strange. He no longer spoke about dominance or enemies. He asked about schedules, about whether shipments were delayed, about whether strikes were happening. He wasn't asking about control. He was asking whether the system still held. And every answer, in one form or another, was the same. Yes, Chicago was still working. That answer followed him into his final years. Chicago was still working. Factories hummed through winter mornings. Trucks rolled before dawn. Tires cutting clean lines through slush and snow. Dock hands clocked in without knowing whose interests they truly served. Only that their pay arrived on time and trouble rarely found them anymore. That was the victory no one celebrated. Capone became a memory while still alive. A man people spoke about in the past tense even when he was only miles away. His legend grew larger as his presence shrank. Stories exaggerated, timelines blurred, truth bent around myth. But the city didn't run on stories. It ran on habits. Men like Nitti and Rika aged into administrators rather than enforcers. Younger crews were trained not to shoot first, but to wait, to observe, to understand the machinery before touching it. Impulse was corrected early. Recklessness was quietly punished. Chicago had become allergic to chaos. World War II tightened supply lines and brought federal eyes back to the docks. But the system absorbed it. Paperwork adjusted. Routes shifted. Delays became explanations instead of crises. The city proved it could survive pressure without panic. That was the final evolution. Capone, once the loudest man in any room, now understood the most dangerous men were the ones no one noticed leaving. In moments of clarity, he spoke less about what he'd taken and more about what he'd preserved. He no longer bragged about owning Chicago. He spoke instead about having taught it something. That power didn't need to shout. That fear burned out. That systems, once built correctly, outlived the men who designed them. Visitors sometimes mistook his calm for regret. It wasn't. It was recognition. Capone knew he had played his part. He had been the necessary disruption, the pressure that forced adaptation. Without him, the city would have stayed reckless longer, bloodier, dumber. He had shortened the learning curve. Outside, Chicago carried on without sentiment. New names rose, new alliances formed. Old rules stayed intact, and that was the clearest sign of all. The king was gone. The kingdom no longer needed one. No one announced the end of Al Capone's era. There was no closing chapter written in ink or blood, no final confrontation, no last command echoed through a room. His time simply dissolved, absorbed into the rhythm of a city that had learned how to function without kings. Chicago didn't mourn him. It remembered him the way cities remember storms, not with affection, but with respect for the damage and the change left behind. Men who had once feared Capone now spoke of him as a turning point. Before him, everything had been reckless. After him, everything had rules. He had shown them how fast power could grow, and how fragile it became when it demanded attention. The outfit no longer chased dominance. It maintained balance. Territory mattered less than flow. Reputation mattered less than reliability. The smartest men avoided headlines the way they once avoided bullets. And the unions, steady, disciplined, indispensable, remained the silent backbone of it all. They never wore the crown. They never needed to. Capone's health continued to fade, but his mind, when clear, lingered on patterns rather than people. He asked about timing, about coordination, about whether disruptions were being smoothed out before they spread. He wasn't asking as a boss anymore. He was asking as an architect, checking whether the structure still stood. And it did. Chicago had learned the lesson completely. Loud men attract challengers. Visible power invites resistance. But systems, quiet, layered, patient, are almost impossible to kill. By the time Capone's name stopped appearing in conversations altogether, the city was already far beyond him. It had outgrown the need for singular figures. Decisions were no longer centralized in one voice, one temper, one ambition. They were distributed, shared, buffered, protected. That was the final inheritance, not fear, not legend, but continuity. And the city carried it forward without ceremony, without gratitude, without pause, exactly the way Capone, in his clearest moments, had always hoped it would. Years later, when Capone was gone and even his loudest stories had begun to fade, Chicago still moved to the rhythm he helped set. Not his voice, not his temper, his restraint. Men who never met him still followed rules they couldn't name. They understood, instinctively, that some lines were not crossed, not because of fear, but because crossing them broke the machine. And once the machine broke, everyone bled. That understanding became tradition. New operators arrived with ambition burning hot in their chests. Most didn't last. They talked too much, moved too fast, tried to prove themselves in a city that no longer rewarded proof. Chicago had matured past theatrics. Those who survived learned quickly. They learned to sit when others stood, to listen when others demanded, to wait. Capone's greatest influence wasn't the money he made or the enemies he buried. It was the silence he normalized, the idea that true authority didn't need confirmation, that if the city worked, you were winning, even if no one knew your name. By the late 1940s, the outfit existed more as infrastructure than organization. Its edges blurred into legitimate business, labor management, and political routine. Removing it would have meant dismantling half the city's logistics. No one seriously tried. Capone had once ruled Chicago by force. What followed him ruled by necessity. And necessity is harder to fight than fear. Old men sitting in quiet rooms, far from Cicero, sometimes spoke of him when the night grew long. They remembered the cigar smoke, the confidence, the way he stayed seated while power walked toward him. They understood now why that moment mattered. Because it wasn't about arrogance, it wasn't about dominance. It was about knowing when the fight was already won. Chicago never carved his name into stone, never raised statues, never needed reminders. The city itself was the monument, still moving, still breathing, still working, exactly as he intended. By the time historians began arguing about Al Capone, Chicago had already rendered its verdict. Not in words, in function. The trains ran, the docks unloaded, the streets held. Cities don't care about morality, they care about continuity. And Chicago had learned, through blood, through fear, through adaptation, that continuity required restraint more than dominance. Capone had forced that lesson into existence. He had risen too fast, burned too bright, and drawn too many eyes. But in doing so, he exposed every weakness in the old way of ruling, every inefficiency, every needless escalation, every ego-driven war that bled profit and invited collapse. Others learned from his excess. They learned to disappear. By the early 1950s, the outfit's influence could no longer be mapped cleanly. It wasn't centralized. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with threats or gunfire. It existed in approvals that came too easily, in delays that never happened, in problems that resolved themselves before anyone realized they existed. That was the refinement. Men who tried to resurrect Capone's style failed quickly. They mistook legend for instruction. They thought intimidation was power. They thought visibility meant relevance. Chicago corrected them. Quietly. Capone, in his final years, no longer followed news closely. Names meant little. Dates blurred. But when asked about Chicago, about whether it still held together, he always seemed to understand the answer before it was given. Yes, it was still working. That was the only measure that ever mattered, because power that collapses when the man is gone was never power at all. It was noise. What Capone left behind wasn't an empire. It was a method, and methods once learned don't die. The method spread without being taught. No manuals, no meetings, no speeches passed down to the next generation. It traveled the way instincts do, through observation, through consequences, through watching what survived and what didn't. Men learned that shouting brought attention. Attention brought scrutiny. Scrutiny brought collapse. So they stopped shouting. They learned that power drawn too tightly around one man snapped the moment that man fell. So they loosened it, distributed it, built redundancies that didn't look like protection until protection was needed. Chicago became resilient, not because it was stronger than other cities, because it was smarter. Capone's era became a reference point, not a blueprint. The cautionary tale everyone understood without needing to repeat it out loud. His rise showed what was possible. His fall showed the cost of being seen too clearly. The balance that followed felt almost boring by comparison. And that boredom was intentional. When nothing dramatic happened, it meant everything was working. Years passed without a single event anyone could point to and say, that's when it ended, because nothing ended. It just evolved. Old names faded, new ones appeared briefly, then learned to stay quiet, or disappeared altogether. The city trained its own caretakers, men who didn't want crowns, men who didn't want credit, men who understood that survival depended on maintaining the machine, not claiming ownership of it. Capone's greatest legacy wasn't fear or wealth. It was discipline. The discipline to know when to sit, the discipline to when not to speak, the discipline to understand that once a system works, the most dangerous thing you can do is remind people who built it. Chicago remembered that lesson long after Capone was gone. And as long as the city kept working, day after day, truck after truck, shift after shift, the lesson never needed to be spoken again. In the end, there was no final reckoning, no moment where the city paused to reflect on what Al Capone had been or what he had become. Chicago didn't look backward, it never had. It moved forward, indifferent to legends, loyal only to momentum. Capone's name survived in books, in barroom stories, in arguments about morality and crime. But the city he once dominated didn't survive on his reputation. It survived on what replaced him. Order without ceremony, power without noise, control without a face. The men who came after him rarely spoke his name aloud. Not out of fear, out of understanding. They knew that invoking legends invited comparison, and comparison invited mistakes. Chicago no longer tolerated mistakes. Capone had once believed ruling meant being seen. What endured proved the opposite. The strongest influence he ever exerted wasn't when he stood at the center of attention, but when he chose to remain seated, when he decided that restraint was more effective than force, and when he allowed the city to learn how to function without depending on him. That was the paradox of his legacy. He became irrelevant so that what he built could survive. Chicago kept breathing, kept working, kept moving money, people, and power through channels so well designed they appeared natural. And that was the final truth Capone understood before everything else faded. A man can rule a city for a moment, but if he's smart enough, he can teach it how to rule itself. There was no ceremony at the end, no final meeting, no gunshot echoing through an empty street to announce that an era had closed. Chicago didn't mark the moment Al Capone became history. It didn't need to. The city had already moved past him. That was the real legacy. Capone's name lived on in stories, in arguments, in myths sharpened by time. But Chicago itself ran on something far quieter than legend. It ran on structure, on discipline, on agreements that never needed to be written down. He had once ruled through fear. What survived him ruled through function. Factories opened on time. Trucks rolled without interruption. Men showed up, got paid, and went home. That was power in its purest form. Capone had been the storm, loud, impossible to ignore, destructive enough to force change. But storms don't last. What lasts is what gets built afterward. The system's designed to withstand the next one. In his final years, when names and dates slipped away, one question remained clear in his mind. Is Chicago still working? Yes, it always was. Because in the end, power isn't measured by how many people fear your name. It's measured by how seamlessly the world keeps moving when you're gone. And if this story of strategy, restraint, and the unseen forces that truly shape history resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Share it with someone who understands that the most dangerous power is the kind you never see coming. Let me know in the comments. If you were in that room, would you rule like a king or build something that survives without you? Keep fighting for your crown. I'll see you in the next one.